Welcome to EDPS Talks produced by the European Data Protection Supervisor. In each interview, we bring leading voices from all around the world to share their unique perspectives on data protection and privacy, and to discuss how these two rights affect their respective fields. In today's talk, it is an honor to discuss these topics with our guest, United Nations Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, Mr. Amandeep Singh Gill. Mr. Singh Gill represents a thought leader on digital technology. His expertise in digital technologies is complemented with a keen understanding of how the digital transformation can be used for progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Previously, he served as Executive Director and co-lead of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, where he contributed to draft UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. He also served as the Chief Executive Officer of the International Digital Health and Artificial Intelligence Research Collaborative Project, based at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Thank you, Mr. Gill, for joining us and welcome to our 20th anniversary talks.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you. I would like to start this interview with a question that aims at the essence of UN Secretary General's Envoy on technology. What does privacy mean to you?
Of course, at the United Nations, we are guided by Article 12 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that enshrines privacy as a fundamental right. To me, personally speaking, privacy is a fundamental dimension of human dignity and freedom. It is about human agency in terms of how we process life's challenges, with whom and how, without being subject to the prejudices, hostility, or coercion of others. So, in many ways, it's intimately linked to our right to life and liberty. And this is something that Supreme Courts and other judicial authorities around the world have upheld. If you look at the US Supreme Court, how it has interpreted the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, and the Fourth Amendment, um, into yeah, right to privacy. Likewise, the Indian Supreme Court has interpreted this right to privacy as intrinsic to life and personal liberty under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. So, this is the kind of understanding that we operate under at the United Nations when it comes to privacy.
Thank you very much. Um, the second question relates to, unfortunately, recent developments. In the last few years, we've experienced a global pandemic, inflation, wars, climate change, and something that affects us very closely, which is massive growing online disinformation. This is all bringing us to a difficult moment, a difficult period, and one can say even to a stagnation. But you've been making some interesting proposals that brought my attention. You've been advocating for a new type of discussion around data commons and digital champions. Please tell us more about these proposals, these ideas.
Yes. So the notion of digital commons is central to my boss, the UN Secretary General's vision for an open, free, secure, and inclusive digital future. We are all familiar with the commons of the past, pastures, water bodies, and we are all familiar with the tragedy of the commons, where there is misuse. Some people, pirates and buccaneers and others, they misuse these commons for their own nefarious ends. And if you bring that into the digital space, obviously there is data extraction, exploitation, undermining of privacy, and use of data in unfair ways. At the same time, alongside this misuse problem, we have a misuse problem. Commons need to be used. So if a pasture is not used for grazing, then and is left fallow, then there are consequences. So how to make the use inclusive and how to ensure that everyone can access the benefits. That is part of the vision of digital commons. So, in a nutshell, it's about having common rails and guardrails to promote use and prevent misuse. Now, how does that concretely work in the data space? I think data protection is key. At the same time, data empowerment is also important. And Europe has led on that. Other countries are also putting in place data protection and data empowerment frameworks where citizens have agency over their data and where those who are interested in innovating with data in the private sector, in the public sector, can access data sets in responsible ways, respecting privacy, respecting security of data, and use that data to improve lives, to put in place innovative solutions. So, this is our vision of digital commons, data commons. And for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it's essential that we leverage data responsibly because we are lagging behind on progress and we need to catch up. And the only way to do that is to deploy technology. And data presents a massive opportunity to speed up decision making, to fine tune government policies in real time, and to bring together data sets, for instance, to develop new climate change resilient agriculture varieties for research, for development. So that's, in a sense, the vision that we have and the work that we're doing around digital commons. I must say, to close on this question, digital commons are not built overnight. So you need digital champions who are working in the open source space. So the open source community creates, in a sense, the basis for developing digital public goods, whether it's digital identities or payment mechanisms. And then these can be stacked up into a digital public infrastructure, which acts as these common rails and guardrails on which innovation can happen, on which you really have commons um, coming to life in a real sense for use and the avoiding of misuse.
Fantastic. I think from your words, indeed, there is a public opinion, international public opinion emerging about the need of finding a good balance between data protection and the use of the data in a meaningful way for the benefit of humankind. This is a very interesting idea. Thank you very much for that. Now, looking at the new technologies, so some of them can be very disruptive and they need to be tackled by governments, by international organizations to understand what is their impact on society and on individuals' privacy. One of the goals of the UN and also of the EU is to shape the future of AI technologies. Do you see any possible convergence between the UN and the EU on the principles on AI? And a different question, but also related. How can we ensure ethical deployment of artificial intelligence in order to protect human rights and to prevent potential misuse?
This is a very important question, and the EU and the UN have been working closely on this subject. The Secretary General has set up a high level advisory body on AI to support the efforts of member states, private sector, and other stakeholders on better governance of AI so that we can manage its risks and also access the opportunities and the benefits. Now, this advisory body, which has many eminent members from the European Union, has submitted an interim report, some suggestions about what kind of principles should we follow when it comes to the international governance of AI. And of course, the international governance of AI is one layer. There is a very substantial layer, which is a national regional jurisdiction layer. For instance, the EU's commendable AI Act would sit in that important layer. And then there are industry initiatives, self regulation, codes of conduct, which is a third layer. Now, at the international layer, what are the important functions we need to put in place for better governance of AI? So, this is the focus of our work at the UN. And the advisory body has recommended a few essential functions. And one of them is constant horizon scanning, scientific assessments of what the technology is, so that regulators, enforcers such as yourselves can better understand what to do, how to respond, so that we also across the world have a shared assessment of what the risks are, what the opportunities are. And this functionality is very similar to what President Ursula von der Leyen, said at her last State of the European Union address. You know, the need for an IPCC-like body for such assessment. So this is just an example of, how aligned the thinking is. Um, in terms of governance, I mentioned those three layers. I think what is important is that now we have the first regional legislation, national regional legislation on AI. So law-based approaches are important. And we are very confident that these values-based approaches, because the UN Charter, the human rights treaties have certain values, certain principles, and they need to be upheld. So we are very confident that they provide the foundation, but there is an aspect of interoperability across the EU, US, China, other jurisdictions, where we need to think about how do we ensure that we have a common understanding of AI governance? How do we make sure that the private sector does not do forum shopping or jurisdiction shopping? And then there is interoperability at the same time. So, some suggestions being discussed at the UN around a regular dialogue, an international dialogue on AI governance, where different entities such as the EU's AI office, the Safety Institute in the UK, and others can come together and share their perspectives, learn from each other, and perhaps create the knowledge bases for countries that want to follow best practices to develop their own policies. The third dimension I would mention in terms of this alignment is the need for capacity building and support to developing countries as they develop their own digital economies, data and AI ecosystems. So the need to support public officials in particular on AI governance so that they can make the right choices, the need for researchers and innovators, going back to our conversation on digital commons, to access compute resource, to build their own data sets, to develop the talent across different domains, agriculture, and computer science or health and AI, so that they can also participate in the benefits of AI. So this is another area where I think the UN's work and the EU's approach are quite aligned.
Thank you. I personally big fond of history, and I think now humankind is some kind of um, crossroads where the role of United Nations is vital. I think United Nations was born in a moment where humankind was leaving the horrors of the Second World War, and United Nations fundamental rights, human rights principles were there precisely to guide these horrors should never happen again, because we are now invest on the dignity of individuals. Now we are in a similar situation where the eruption of these new technologies and AI and everything. So I really think that the work you're doing on from the United Nations is really, really valuable from this perspective. But going back now to the issue of data protection, there there are for example, humanitarian situations across the world where UN has some leverage to intervene and to protect vulnerable people in these situations. So, how can we make sure that privacy or data protection of these individuals is properly respected while conducting this work? What can United Nations do to provide this layer of protection in these difficult situations?
Thank you, firstly, for the kind words about the United Nations. I think that's another value, this values around multilateralism that brings together the EU and the UN. In the kind of situations that you have mentioned, humanitarian situations, natural disasters, displacement of people, unfortunately, we see that with Ukraine and with the situation in the Middle East. The UN is often a first responder. So you have humanitarian agencies on the ground, not only from the UN, others, and often we coordinate, we work together. So there, you may not have a clear jurisdictional framework for data protection, either because it doesn't exist in the territory where you're dealing with a situation, or this is a situation where state structures are weak or under stress at that time. So it's essential for the UN to have its own framework for data protection, and we have developed those guiding principles for our own work, and they are being used by UNHCR, for instance, the High Commissioner for Refugees. They are being used by our colleagues at the World Food Program and others. So we are trying to uphold the best that is there out in the world, including what the EU GDPR has in our own work. This, of course, is never done completely, so we can always improve. So as soon as there are problems and incidents of insufficient, weak data protection, leakage, so we work on those. It's not only about the governance framework, but it's also sometimes about the technology, what kind of platforms are being used. So we have a lot of effort underway in improving the protection, the storage of data. So sometimes it makes our life difficult. So, for instance, in while being in New York, certain platforms are not accessible because we have these high data protection standards, and we rely again a lot on data storage in the European Union under EU GDPR for that kind of work.
Thank you. Um, let's do now an exercise of a crystal ball. Try to figure out how the world could be in 20 years from now, and the things that you think from your long experience uh, we should invest in order to achieve that in these 20 years ahead we will still have technology that is human centric, where the individual remains at the center of the universe and not the robot or the machine. What do you think we should invest, like education? What kind of policies, communities? What would be your investment recommendation?
This is an excellent question, especially when we are preparing for the Summit of the Future. So, in September, the world leaders will come together at the United Nations headquarters here in Geneva for the Summit of the Future. And one of the outcomes at the summit will be a global digital compact, a shared vision of an open, free, secure, and inclusive digital future. So, in the global digital compact negotiations, there's, of course, an emphasis on bridging the digital divide, on accelerating progress on the sustainable development goals by leveraging the digital transformation. There's also, of course, a big emphasis on protection, on human rights online, on trust and safety, on making sure that marginalized communities are not further marginalized. And then, third key pillar is that of emerging technologies, because as you pointed out, 20 years from now we'll be in a different space. So today AI is one of those emerging technologies, but tomorrow it could be something else. So we need to have more agile institutions in place. We need to have, as I mentioned in the case of AI, this kind of horizon scanning every 6 months. We can't wait for 5 years to review where things are. So we have to do it faster. And second, we have to be more multi stakeholder in our approaches. So governments alone will not be able to do it. Often they might not even have the capacity to understand what's going on. So we need to work with academia, with civil society, with private sector. So more of a multi stakeholder approach. And then I would, as you pointed out, as you hinted at, I would double down on strengthening our analog institutions. So whether it is political systems, democracies, electoral machineries, or it is our judiciary, our regulators, competition authorities, it is public media, journalists, what goes on in our schools, building societal resilience. So no matter what the technology we are dealing with, hopefully we'll still be human, and our problems are anchored in our analog world, in our nature as human beings, how we operate in societies, in certain contexts, different contexts. So we need to strengthen ourselves as individuals, as societies. If you look back, I mean, we can turn the crystal ball in the other direction, the arrow of time in the other direction. So in 2004, when we were just before the Tunis summit on the World's Summit on Information Society. Uh, Many of the challenges to privacy that we see today did not exist. Social media wasn't there, and the exponential increase in compute capacity that has happened since then, and these personalized mobile devices. I mean, mobile phones were there, but we didn't have this kind of computing power on them. So today we are handling those issues, and often by relying more and more on our analog strengths. So this kind of evolution in terms of the threats and the challenges. Tomorrow, it could be neural technology. So, the ultimate frontier for privacy is the human mind. So, there could be ways in which you could access what our most private thoughts are. So, then, we will be struggling with our current paradigms. But I think if we have the resilience, if we have the agility, if we have strong analog institutions, then we can handle the constantly moving frontier of technology.
Well, thank you very much. It has been a real pleasure and an honor to have you with us today. I found the things you've said very, very reassuring. I think United Nations is in very good hands with your leadership and with this strategic direction that you're showing to the world. I just commend you for that, and I ask you to be as ambitious as you can to put the individual at the center of the universe when talking about digital technologies. I think this is now a moment where this is becoming super, super important. So your leadership from United Nations is very important. You know that for us Europeans, this is in our job description, right? But also having someone like you with this clear strategic orientation in UN is really, really helpful. I hope you can visit us soon, Amandeep, and we can continue this conversation over a cup of coffee here in Brussels. And I thank you very much for your time. I don't know if you would like to conclude with a final thought. Otherwise, I will close the episode, please.
Just want to thank you, Leonardo, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure, and we share this human centric approach to technologies and the digital transformation. I look forward to meeting in person. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. So, thank you for watching this special episode of the EDPS 20th Anniversary Talk series. I am Leonardo Cervera Navas, Secretary General of the European Data Protection Supervisor, and I invite you to follow the EDPS on our channels to discover more about our initiatives marking the 20th anniversary of our institution. Thank you very much for your attention.